I recently played two games that have continued to linger with me long after their credit sequences rolled by. They both serve as fantastic examples of why I originally fell in love with games, and of how the industry can outdo itself whenever developers and publishers go all in on an idea. Unfortunately, both of these titles also exist within franchises that have since been very publicly shelved, sent to an early grave at the behest of their publisher, Sony Computer Entertainment. This video will serve partly as an excuse for me to eulogise these games and to highlight their achievements, but also I hope to shine a light on how unfairly both of these franchises were ultimately treated, and on what we missed out on as players given their unceremonious demise. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing and ringing the algorithm bell so that you don't miss any of my upcoming videos, and be sure to hit the like button too, because robots get to decide what we watch on the internet. For now though, let's take a look at two incredible games. The first title I'd like to talk about is Days Gone, an open-world, narrative-driven survival epic put together by the fine folks over at Bend Studio, and published as a first-party title by Sony in 2019. Now, if you hadn't heard of Bend Studio prior to playing Days Gone or seeing it being mentioned, then you might be familiar with this team's work on the PlayStation 1 and PSP. They were the core development team behind all of the mainline Siphon Filter games, which were all thoroughly enjoyable. And they also made Bubsy 3D, which was a video game that ran. Days Gone was a bit of an experiment for Sony. Bend Studio aren't and weren't a monolithic, supersized studio like Naughty Dog or Guerrilla. They've always been a smaller team with a lot of passion and talent. Here's a clip that accurately summarises both the circumstances of and the ethos around Days Gone's development.
Bend Studio, from a development perspective, to me means a studio that's kind of punching outside its weight class. It's really kind of biting off a lot and chewing it and doing things that people didn't think were possible, and we just kind of said, we're going to make this really big game called Days Gone.
We were given the chance to say, hey, Bend Studio, you can make something brand new, something, you're just going to create this thing.
From the start of the process, we had about 40 to 50 people, but we realized it's next gen, it's big, we need to grow, and so we brought people on strategically to kind of, from other AAA studios to kind of really help us, up our game in every department. It's much bigger than we've ever been, but still way smaller than you would expect for a game this big.
One engineer spearheaded the entire horde, as an example, figured out a way to get 500 creatures on the screen at the same time. I mean, that's an amazing achievement, and that's just one example where we have like peak individuals working at the top of their game, and that's the only reason Days Gone exists.
Playing Days Gone for myself, I could see Bend's ambitious streak in just about every aspect of the game's design. There was a coordinated attempt to blend the more cinematic, atypical Sony brand of AAA game with something that was more organic and freeform, like The Witcher 3. And I gotta say, for a team that small, they got scarily close to perfection in their execution. The open world is absolutely gorgeous, and it feels lived in. More important than that for me though is the gameplay, which is emergent, varied, and it keeps you on your toes at all times. Where Days Gone stumbled the most, I would say, is in its narrative, and in how that narrative slots into the freeform gameplay. And here's the weird thing about that. If you watch all of Days Gone's cutscenes as one long movie, it works. The entire story makes sense, it's well written for the most part, incredibly well acted, and you can sort of, imagine the gameplay that takes place in between. When you experience this narrative as you play through the game though, it can feel a bit clunky and out of place. Deacon, the game's main character, will be angry with someone 1 minute and then happy the next and then angry again, then they'll hate you, then something like this will happen.
I need you to run there as fast as you can, don't stop.
Don't stop.
All right, don't stop, no matter what. You ready? Huh? Go.
So it's a bit all over the place in that respect. Taking all of that into consideration though, I still feel like Days Gone is a solid 8.5 for me on the arbitrary games as a number scale. The way the game feels in motion, the zombie horde mechanics, the characters, the potential that sits within Days Gone as a franchise is palpable. And I'm left with many an anecdote following dozens of random encounters with zombies, zombie bears, people, would-be dictators, the lot. From top to bottom, it's a game that clearly had every possible drop of blood, sweat and tears poured into it, which made it all the more disappointing when Jason Schreier penned a damning report for Bloomberg, which shone a very stinky light on the way in which Sony currently treats its in-house studios. The prognosis? Not good. It turns out Ben's studio made an unsuccessful pitch for a Days Gone sequel to Sony, which would have included a shared universe, co-op play, and I presume would have given some closure to the mother of all cliffhangers that was the game's ending. Following this report, Sony's head of worldwide studios, Herman Hulst, featured in an interview posted on Sony's blog in June, which can only be described as premium tier damage control. Right off the bat, he mentioned Ben's studio, stating, "Ben's studio is working on a very exciting new IP that they're very, very passionate about. They're building on the deep open world systems that they developed with Days Gone, so I'm really happy for Ben's studio." Given what we now know about Days Gone's untimely demise thanks to Jason's report, and the fact that the studio's two most senior leads had left Bend as of December 2020, I can't help interpreting Hulst's comments here as sounding more like a Craig-era Bond villain, delivering false platitudes before shooting a big laser at half of Europe. What bothers me the most about Days Gone's disappearing act, however, is that it's totally indicative of the mentality we've seen spread across the AAA industry since about 2008. I've discussed this previously in my recent video on GTA 4, but in short, it all boils down to the game being great, but not great enough. Days Gone was technically and artistically impressive, it sat at number 1 in the charts, and it sold more physical copies than all of Ben Studio's previous games combined. A series of high-profile and decidedly middle-of-the-road reviews from major gaming outlets, however, along with its failure to match or outdo games by Naughty Dog and Sony Santa Monica sales-wise, all seemingly meant that the franchise was destined for the big box in the ground that takes you to the sky. So why is this an issue? Games get cancelled all the time. Well, from an outside perspective, it just feels like most of the issues present in Days Gone could have been remedied with a patch, never mind a sequel. If Sony were to have fronted the cash and allowed for the time necessary to address these issues, then I feel as though things could have worked out very differently for Days Gone. Plus, I feel like a lot of the criticism levelled at the game by the game's media was a tad unfair. Critics honed in on the game's patchy narrative and were a little too quick to hold that aspect of the game to account as if it was its only worthwhile quality, with a lack of focus being given to everything else the game has to offer as a player-driven, open-world experience. Instead of sticking with Bend and buying into their ambition, Sony have directed them toward crafting a whole new IP, where they could potentially make a lot of the same mistakes all over again. As a huge fan of the game and of games in general, this is heartbreaking. We'll return to Days Gone in a moment to sum everything up, but for now, let's cue the music. Ask anyone who knows me, and they'll tell you that I'll always manage to crowbar one of 3 topics into any conversation surrounding old games: time splitters, greedy publishers, and The Elder Scrolls 4. Well, about 2 months ago, a new mainstay was added to that list: Team Soho's gritty revenge epic, The Getaway. Released in 2002 for the PS2, The Getaway is an open-world crime sandbox set in then modern-day London. Originally slated for release alongside the PS2's launch, the game was delayed for a whopping 27 months so that Team Soho could essentially recreate London and get it running on a PS2. If you've never played The Getaway before, then you might be looking at the footage running in the background here and be thinking to yourself, ah yeah, it's GTA but with a guy who says whenever he kills someone, and you're certainly halfway there. But The Getaway has more in common with the likes of LA Noire than it does with Rockstar's crime opus, and that makes sense considering the game was directed by Brendan McNamara, who went on to direct LA Noire with Team Bondi. The Getaway is a measured, gritty, narrative-focused action-adventure, and playing it today, it feels like a precursor to the mainline releases we see coming from Sony nowadays in terms of its tone, style, and pacing. Gameplay-wise, the game's basic mechanics of driving, shooting, and taking cover haven't really stood the test of time as well as other open-world games from that era. Having said that, it deviates from the norm in some of these areas so considerably that I'd still recommend it to anyone, even today. For starters, there's no HUD. Whilst in a vehicle, you'll find your way to the next objective by the indicators on your car, which leads to some nail-biting moments as you flee the owl boo. When on foot, Mark, this is Mark by the way, will get visibly more beaten up and bloody as he takes damage, and you have to lean against a nearby wall in order to heal up. I'd argue it takes a little too long to do this, but when things get a bit airy in later missions, you'll be glad of the reprieve you get when having a little rest, as it lets you plan out your next move. Arguably the biggest innovation present in the Getaway, however, is its representation of London. No other franchise since has sought to do what the Getaway did with its open world, and I'd hazard a guess that no game even could in this day and age. Absolutely everything from shop fronts to streets to buildings to faces were all scanned in from actual real world stuff. We're well used to that being done nowadays for performance capture, but it was completely surreal to play a game in 2002 that looked and sounded exactly like the world outside my door during that same period, with no compromises in the realism department. Small details, like the fact that these crates very clearly have slabs of Stella Artois and Fosters in them, all the way up to the sightlines and placement of buildings being spot on throughout the entire city. It makes Watch Dogs Legion look like a very OTT theme park in comparison. Now, an important point of distinction between Days Gone and The Getaway in this instance is that The Getaway did in fact receive a sequel 2 years later, subtitled Black Monday, followed by a handheld spin-off on the PSP called Gangs of London. But it was what happened after those games released that sets off the disappointment klaxon for fans. In 2005, Sony London put together this tech demo, which was presented in the midst of one of the most infamous E3 conferences of all time. As a result of Sony's willingness during this era to pass off pre-rendered footage as being rendered on the PS3, it's difficult to tell whether or not this is even real. However, it set tongues wagging nonetheless. Following this, a proper teaser trailer for the next installment in the Getaway series was shown off the following year, in 2006. After this, the game practically went dark, until an internal shake-up at Sony resulted in this new Getaway title and Sony London's other project, 8 Days, being indefinitely put on hold so that the studio could focus on, wait for it, iToy and SingStar. Whilst putting this video together, I reached out to a couple of individuals who I'm aware were with Sony London around this time, in order to get some clarity on what kind of state the Getaway 3 was in prior to its cancellation. But as of recording, I haven't yet heard anything back. So, in summary, 2 big disappointments. 2 cancelled franchises seemingly fated never to return to our screens. It says a lot about the industry and how seasoned we've become as an audience to accept less, given that there's been quite a lot of discourse lately around the potentiality of a Getaway remake. As someone who does enjoy the odd remake, but ultimately feels they're a little safe and fruitless, I fear that even a remake of the Getaway would be out of reach in this day and age, owing to the complexity of the game's world. And a reboot or sequel would be even less likely to materialise, given how risky it would be overall. What happened to Days Gone and The Getaway isn't just a Sony problem, it's an industry problem. However, it is a little more disappointing to learn of these missed opportunities when it's Sony who are at the helm. Sony, who have always made a point of positioning themselves as the torchbearers of new, innovative experiences, have very blatantly dropped the ball at various points throughout their history, with these 2 franchises serving as a prime example of that. As I've mentioned in various other videos on my channel, my biggest concern is that the hugely inflated risk, cost and time associated with making AAA games these days is only going to further stifle creativity and innovation at the highest tier of game production. Sony still like to position themselves as innovators and as dreamers, but given the sheer amount of evidence we now know, a somewhat inverted version of this reality is repeatedly coming to light. I enjoy playing PlayStation exclusives, and I quite like my PS5, but I know it can do more. I don't think we'll ever see a return to the golden era of PS1 and PS2 development, but I'll be keeping my fingers crossed. Either that, or they can relaunch PlayStation Home, the artifact of Second Life clones.